Let's slow this story down because if you've been following the headlines, you probably think you already know what happened. Canada announced a digital services tax. American tech companies pushed back. Washington called it unfair. Trade retaliation was mentioned. And that's where most coverage stops. But that version of events leaves out the part that actually matters, the part that explains why this was not a sudden escalation, not a political accident, and not a misunderstanding between allies. It was the predictable outcome of a global system that no longer matches the economy it is trying to govern. On the surface, this story has been framed as a confrontation between Canada and Silicon Valley, a middle power challenging some of the most valuable corporations on Earth. From a distance, it looks like a bold political move, maybe even a symbolic one. But when you step away from the headlines and look at the structure underneath, something else becomes clear. This wasn't about sending a message. It was about closing a gap that has been widening quietly for years. Canada's digital services tax is designed to apply to large multinational technology firms that generate significant revenue from Canadian users, but pay relatively little corporate tax in Canada. That is not speculation. It is a documented feature of how global digital firms structure their operations. Profits are often booked in low-tax jurisdictions. Revenues flow across borders instantly. But the economic activity that makes those revenues possible, the users, the data, the advertising markets, the public infrastructure, all remain anchored in specific countries. That mismatch is the core problem. For years, governments tried to solve this problem through international coordination. The OECD process was meant to update global tax rules for a digital economy. Negotiations dragged on, deadlines slipped, temporary frameworks replaced permanent solutions. And during that time, digital revenues kept growing. Public tax bases did not. Eventually, countries faced a choice: keep waiting or act alone. Canada chose to act. From Washington's perspective, the response was immediate and familiar. Officials argued the tax unfairly targets American firms. Trade rules were cited. Retaliatory measures were discussed. The implication was that Canada was risking economic consequences by confronting companies that sit at the center of the U.S. economy. But that response rested on an assumption that no longer holds. The assumption that digital giants are untouchable and that countries dependent on the U.S. market will always back down first. That assumption ignores how incentives actually work. Canada did not introduce this tax to punish anyone. It did it to reduce exposure to a system that had become structurally unsustainable. When a government relies increasingly on consumption taxes and labor taxes, while highly profitable digital firms contribute comparatively little, the imbalance compounds over time. That is not ideology. It is arithmetic. Eventually, public services strain, deficits widen, and political pressure builds. At that point, inaction becomes the riskier option. The idea that Canada could simply absorb the costs of doing nothing misunderstands the situation. Digital taxation is not a marginal issue for public finance anymore. It goes directly to the question of who pays for the systems that modern economies depend on. Roads, education, healthcare, legal systems, and digital infrastructure all support corporate activity. When firms benefit from those systems without contributing proportionally, the burden shifts elsewhere, usually onto workers and consumers. This is where the story starts to move beyond abstract policy and into real economic consequences. When governments introduce a new tax on digital services, companies respond. They adjust prices, they shift costs, they reevaluate market strategies. Some of those costs are passed on to advertisers. Some are absorbed internally. Some show up indirectly in higher prices for goods and services that rely on digital platforms. The effects are distributed unevenly, quietly, and over time. Supporters of the tax argue that this is still preferable to allowing a permanent erosion of the tax base. Critics warn that it could slow innovation or raise costs for small businesses. Both arguments exist in mainstream debate. What matters is understanding that neither outcome is accidental. They are the result of how power and risk are allocated in a digital economy. There is another layer that rarely gets discussed: risk pricing. When governments signal that digital markets will be taxed or regulated more assertively, firms do not just respond to the tax itself. They price in uncertainty. That uncertainty shows up as a risk premium embedded in contracts, fees, and long-term planning decisions. It doesn't appear in political speeches. It appears in balance sheets. And that premium is not paid by governments. It is paid by businesses and consumers, slowly and often invisibly. This is how economic policy moves from legislation into daily life, not through dramatic shocks, but through incremental cost shifts that accumulate until they become impossible to ignore. What makes this episode revealing is not that Canada challenged powerful companies. It's that the challenge exposed how limited traditional retaliation tools have become. Trade retaliation works best when supply chains are simple and leverage is clear. That is not the digital economy. Canada and the United States are deeply integrated. Retaliatory tariffs would not land cleanly on a single sector. They would ripple through manufacturing, services, and consumer markets on both sides of the border. That reality constrains Washington's options. Analysts have noted that while the rhetoric of retaliation is loud, the mechanics are far more complicated. Every potential response carries domestic costs. That makes escalation politically expensive. Canada understands this. So do other countries considering similar measures. This is why the digital tax debate cannot be reduced to a bilateral dispute. It is part of a broader global pattern. France, the United Kingdom, members of the European Union, and countries like India have all moved in similar directions, not because they coordinated a challenge to the United States, but because they faced the same structural pressure, a growing digital economy operating under tax rules designed for a different era. Media coverage often frames these moves as nationalist or protectionist, but that framing misses the core issue. This is not about closing markets. It is about redefining where value is created and who has the authority to tax it. In the industrial economy, value was tied to factories, workers, and physical assets. In the digital economy, value is tied to networks, data, and users. Tax systems have not fully caught up. Critics sometimes describe digital taxes as a punishment for success. Supporters respond that success is not the issue. The issue is alignment. When profitability becomes detached from physical presence, the link between economic activity and public contribution breaks down. Fixing that link is not a radical move. It is a corrective one. What often goes unexamined is how uneven the distribution of costs and benefits really is. Large firms have the scale to absorb or redistribute new taxes. Smaller firms operating on thin margins feel changes more acutely. Consumers feel them indirectly. Governments see revenue increases on paper. This creates political tension, not because the policy is inherently flawed, but because its effects are diffuse while its symbolism is concentrated. The sovereignty argument sits at the center of this debate. Canada's position is straightforward. If economic activity occurs within its borders, it has the right to tax it. That principle is not new. What is new is the form of economic activity. Data flows do not respect borders, but societies still function within them. That mismatch is the source of friction. From Washington's perspective, the concern is precedent. If every country introduces its own digital tax, firms face a fragmented landscape of overlapping rules. That concern is not unfounded, but it is also a consequence of delayed global reform. When multilateral solutions stall, unilateral actions fill the gap, not because countries prefer fragmentation, but because they cannot afford paralysis. What this moment ultimately reveals is not a breakdown in the Canada-US relationship. It reveals a breakdown between economic reality and institutional design. The digital economy has outpaced the rules meant to govern it. Governments are responding in imperfect, sometimes messy ways. But the direction of travel is clear. This is not a loud power shift. It is a quiet one. States are reasserting authority over economic spaces that had effectively drifted beyond their reach. Corporations are adjusting to a world where regulatory holidays are no longer guaranteed. Neither side is acting out of malice. Both are responding to incentives. If this confrontation feels uncomfortable, that is because it is exposing vulnerabilities that were always there. Public finances dependent on outdated tax models, corporate strategies built on regulatory gaps, political systems struggling to explain structural issues in a soundbite-driven media environment. And this is why focusing on personalities misses the point. This story is not about who looks tough or who blinked first. It is about whether democratic states can adapt their fiscal systems to an economy that no longer fits within old boundaries. That question will not go away, regardless of how this particular dispute is resolved. even if Canada delays or modifies its tax, even if Washington negotiates exemptions. The underlying pressure remains. Digital profits will continue to grow. Public demands for revenue will continue to rise. The gap will keep widening until it is addressed. This is not the beginning of a trade war. It is the early stage of a structural renegotiation, one that will play out across countries, sectors, and years. Different headlines, different disputes, same underlying logic. If we do not understand that logic, we will keep being surprised by outcomes that were entirely predictable, and we will keep mistaking temporary calm for resolution. The digital tax showdown is not about Canada versus Silicon Valley. It is about whether the rules of the global economy can be rewritten to match the world as it actually exists.